Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our Coffee Time with God Bible study. We are in Judges chapter 3, and the goal this morning is we want to get through the entire chapter. We'll see if that actually happens, but we're going to break it into a few different parts, 4 different parts this morning. We're going to first talk about the first 6 verses. Where we learned that there were some nations that had not fully been taken care of in the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, but some interesting verses there where it says that they were left there by God. And so we'll talk about what that means. And then we'll talk about the first judge of Israel named Othniel. We've talked about him before. He was the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. He was the nephew of Caleb that earned just this prestige with Caleb and earned Caleb's daughter's hand in marriage. And then we will learn about Ehud, the second judge of Israel. And then finally, Shamgar, who just has one verse in the whole body, or the whole Bible, rather, about him. And we'll learn a little bit about how that points us to Christ as well. But let's start in verse 1 of chapter 3. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generations of the people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. And so that's an interesting verse when we read that he's about to tell you what nations were left for the children of Israel to contend with, and the statement is that they were left there by the Lord, so in order to teach war to those who had not yet learned to fight war. And so the nations listed are, it gives the 5 lords of the Philistines. And a little later, when we get to the life of David, we'll learn about the 5 lords of the Philistines and what sort of things they represent. But surely all of these nations left to test Israel, for us as believers, as Christians, they represent certain things. So the 5 lords of the Philippines, or the Philistines, the Philippines weren't part of the Bible story at all, but the Philistines had 5 lords that Israel had to contend with. And then all the Canaanites and the Sidonians and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for the testing of Israel. And so that word right there, I want you to pick up on. They were for the testing of Israel. In verse 2, it talks about the fact that they needed to be taught how to fight war. But in verse 4, it says they were for the testing of Israel. Now, in our modern ears, when we hear that word testing, we think of, oh, this is to see whether I'm good enough or not, to see whether I've been approved. But when the Bible speaks of testing, it's not to see whether you are worthy. It is to make you worthy. It's to teach you. It's to build you up. That's what testing is for. Like gold is refined by fire. That means it's tested by fire. You don't check to see if it's gold. Yes, you can. Some people can use it that way. But the purpose of God in testing is to approve you. It's to teach you. It's to build you up and to help you become more of what He created you to be. So these nations there in verse 4 were for the testing of Israel, to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which He commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. Now, if you'll remember, we haven't gone over it in this study, but in Joshua, at the very end of Joshua's life, he reminds all of the children of Israel of the commandments of Moses, and he renews the covenant with them. And he says, if you do these things, God will be with you. If you don't do these things, then He won't be with you. If you serve and you love and you honor God with your lives, He's going to watch out for you. He's going to prosper you. But if you serve and follow after these other gods, the gods of the Canaanites, then He's actually going to be against you. And all of the people of Israel said real loudly, oh, we're going to do it. We are going to follow God. And Joshua said, just as as bluntly as possible, he said, "No, you won't." They're like, "Yes, we will. We promise. We will honor this covenant." And so Joshua, knowing that they wouldn't, it reminds me of even God when he cut covenant with Moses. He knew the children of Israel were not going to honor the covenant. In fact, when he was first delivering the messages to Moses, if you'll remember, Moses is up on the mountain having this great quality time with God, while the children of Israel are down at the foot of the mountain having a wild party and worshiping idols. And when they get down there, Moses' brother Aaron, he throws the fire under the bus. He says, "Oh, hey, listen, we just threw the gold in and out came this calf. I don't know how it happened. But we know that Aaron actually forged this calf, this golden calf that they were worshiping." And so God is able to cut covenant with a people that he knows will not be able to obey, because it is not his intention that he should say, "Here's the standard, live up to it or else." He's saying, "Here's the standard, walk with me, and I will help you to live up to it." And that's really what it means to be a Christian. Is Jesus says this is the standard. Of course, when Jesus showed up, he took the standards of Moses and Joshua and he raised the bar, right? And yet Jesus says, "Walk with me, and I will help you to live up to this standard. But apart from me, you can't do any of it. You need to do it with me." And that same understanding was in God's heart the whole time. And so he knew that they were going to need to learn how to follow his commands. They were going to need to learn how to do what it is he had called them to do. And in verse 5 it says, "So the people of Israel lived among the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. And their daughters they took to themselves for wives, and their own daughters they gave to their sons." And then the tragic little line there at the end of verse 6 is, "And they served their gods." And so it didn't take but one generation for the children of Israel to turn away from God and to start serving the lesser gods. And it says it's because they intermarried with these other cultures, and they lived among them, and they let them live with them, and they lived with them. And it gives the names of these peoples. And now Canaanite is sort of an overarching term for the whole land. So the Canaanites is just a general catch-all for all of these people. And then the Hittites, which descended from one of Canaan's sons, Het, I believe his name was. And then the Amorites, which descended from another of Canaan's sons, Amor. And then the Perizzites. Now Perizzites, he didn't have a son named Perez. Perizzites is kind of a Hebrew word for hillbilly. Whereas the Canaanites would have been those who lived in the cities and had sort of this culture and finance and wars and kings. Whereas hillbilly would have been like, those people who lived out in the tents, didn't live in a city. So it's the difference between urban and rural. And so when you talk about the Canaanites, you're talking about the urban city dwellers. When you talk about the Perizzites, you're talking about the rural folk, the country folk. Okay? And then it says the Hivites, which is the descendants of another of Canaan's sons, and then the Jebusites, descendants of Jebus, another of Canaan's sons. So these are all descendants of Canaan, who was the son of Ham, and Ham would have been the son of Noah. And if you remember all the way back in Genesis, after the flood, which is kind of it's an odd story. It's not one of those Sunday school stories. But after the flood, when they get out of the ark, Noah plants a vineyard. And then he makes wine. And then he gets drunk on that wine. And he's wandering around in his tent naked. And his son, Ham, goes in and sees him. But rather than defend his father's honor and quietly cover it up, he goes and he tells everybody else what's going on. And so it's just this nature in Ham as one who doesn't look out for another, but instead has sport with the faults of others. Whereas the other two sons, Japheth and Shem, they go into this father's tent and they walk backwards with a covering, and they cover over their father's nakedness without looking upon it. They just cover over it. It reminds me of that New Testament scripture. It says that love covers over a multitude of sins. And the way we treat others is a major part of who we're supposed to be in Christ, right? And so Ham got the brunt of Noah's disdain, but so much so that he cursed Ham's offspring, Canaan. And these are the Canaanites that live in this land that God has promised to Israel. But what the tragic part of that whole series there is these people were left by God to teach them, to show them how to overcome these things. And yet they failed miserably in that rather than even trying to overcome, rather than trying to fight, they intermarry and they get infected with the idolatry of these other nations, and they begin to serve the lesser gods. And so a real quick takeaway for us from verses 1 through 6 would be that when we encounter various trials in life as believers in Christ, rather than just finding the easy way out, which we're very good at doing, we find the easy way out a lot of times. Instead of choosing holiness, we choose compromise. And we compromise. Very few of us would just compromise 100% the first time we come up against a trial. But what compromise does is it causes you to make little micro compromises, like little micro fractures in something. And it reminds me of the way steel is tested, that they measure the microfractures in steel when they put so much weight and pressure on this steel. And if microfractures start to appear in this steel, then they call it right there. They don't wait for the steel to actually break. It's that very first microfracture is what they call the tolerance of that steel. And if you have bad steel, it doesn't take very much weight for it to start to get microfractures in it. Which the problem is once you have a microfracture, any kind of weight after that can compromise it. It could go at any time. And so the same is true of us. As soon as we make a little micro compromise, as soon as our character and our holiness is fractured just a little bit, it's not going to take much for us to go a little bit further. We talk about, in secular society about gateway drugs, that somebody will start with a certain drug and it'll lead to another and it'll lead to another, and before you know it, they're strung out on anything they can find. And so it's just, but nobody just goes here first. They start way over here and then they go that over the deep end over a period of time, sometimes years. But it all began way back here. And the same is true for our hearts when it comes to sin and abandoning holiness and making those compromises. We start small, but then it goes big over time. Let's move on to Othniel, which, if you remember, a few weeks ago we learned that Othniel means the strength or force of God, and it's the same Hebrew word that they use to describe a lion. So the lion of God is really what Othniel, that name, means, and that invokes all kinds of images for us. We call Jesus even today the Lion of Judah, right? And just so happens that Othniel was of the tribe of Judah. So you could easily say that Othniel is the Lion of Judah, and I believe that he represents Jesus again in this story, just as he did the first time we were introduced to him. But let's start in verse 7 through 11. We'll read this story, and we'll glean what we can from it. It says, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asheroth. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against them." And we've talked about this before too. The last person you ever want to be against you is the Lord. But they started serving these other gods, and God actually rose up against the children of Israel. And then it says in the middle of verse 8, "And he sold them into the hand of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the people of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. So 8 years of slavery. And this would not be the kind of slavery that comes to mind for us, but this was, you're going to work your crops and we'll give you enough to live off of, but most of what you harvest is going to be sent to us. You pay tribute to me. And that's sort of how kings would take over other nations. They would force them into labor, which is exactly what Israel was doing to the Canaanites in the land. Rather than wipe them out, they just put them to forced labor, and they would make them work in the fields, and any crops that they grew, they could live off of it, but the bounty, the abundance would be given to the Israelites. And then in verse 9, but when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel, who saved them, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand. And his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim, and the land had rest for 40 years. And then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So in verses 7 through 11, we have this story where this foreign king comes in and subjugates the people of Israel to forced labor. And then in verse 9, they call out to the Lord, and the Lord answers. And this is going to be the case every single time that the people of God call out to God, he will answer. And this is the same promise that he has for us. He says, if you call, I will answer. If you call, I will answer. I was listening to a sermon this morning, and one of the things that the pastor said in it was, there's one thing that all of you who are believers in Jesus Christ, one thing that all of you have in common. Every single one of you can share this common element of your testimony, is that when you called upon the Lord to save you, he answered. When you called upon the Lord to save you, he answered. And that is the common thread for every single child of God, is when you call, he answers. And we have that same story in here, is that when Israel called out to the Lord, he answered. And this is because he made a covenant with them, knowing that they were going to be the kind of people who were prone to break covenant, to walk away, just like you and I are. But he is going to be faithful to his covenant. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. He will fight against us at times, as he did with Israel, but he will never leave you, and he will never forsake you. And every time you turn to him, he will turn to you. And that's a promise that we can count on. Let's go on to learn about Ehud. Now, this is an interesting story. Again, not one that we commonly hear in Sunday school, but it's a good one. And we've got some things we can learn from it as well. In verse 12, it says, and the people of Israel, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So that means they turned away from God and they started following the other gods again. And so the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He gathered to himself the Ammonites and the Amalekites, and he went and he defeated Israel. And they took possession of the city of palms, and the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. So this is 18 years of forced labor that Israel is having to pay tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. And then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. Verse 15. And thus the Lord raised up for them a deliverer. Every time we call, he will send a deliverer. And he sent Ehud, it says in verse 15, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. The people of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, the king of Moab. So here's Ehud. A couple interesting things to learn about him before we hear the rest of the story. He's a Benjamite. Okay, now Benjamin was the youngest son of Jacob, and Benjamin, the name means son of my right hand. So isn't it interesting that here is Ehud, who is a Benjamite, son of the right hand, but it makes a point of pointing out that he's actually left-handed. So this left-handed man from the tribe of the son of the right hand, and his name is Ehud. And Ehud is just another version, if you will, of the name Judah. Okay? The original judge, Othniel, was of the tribe of Judah. Judah means praise. So I will praise God. And Ehud is another version of that same word, same roots, and it means praise. And so this person is going to praise God, but with his left hand. All right, and it's a neat story how he delivers Israel, and he's being sent to pay this tribute to Eglon. Verse 16. And Ehud made for himself a sword with two edges, a cubit in length, and he bound it on his right thigh under his clothes. And he presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. And when Ehud had finished presenting the tribe, he sent away the people who carried the tribute. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he commanded silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. And Ehud came to him, and as he was sitting alone in the cool roof chamber, and Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. So Eglon sort of, oh, God would like to talk to me. I will listen. Eglon had no problems hearing what good thing God was going to say about him. And in verse 21, and Ehud reached with his left hand. Remember, most people were right-handed. A sword would have been on the left-hand side of their hip. But he made this sword and he hung it on his right-hand side. And that's easier for you to pull out with your left hand. And so he wasn't checked on that side. They would only have checked the one side where the sword was, or so I've heard it taught. And he has this blade hidden there, and he grabs it with his left hand, and he took the sword from his right thigh, and he thrust it into his belly, Eglon's belly. And in verse 22, and the hilt also went in after the blade. So it went in deep, and the fat closed over the blade. And he did not pull the sword out of his belly, and dung came out. So the implication here being that he drove this sword into this guy's gut and buried it, just much like you would bury the head of a nail in a piece of wood. He drove this sword into this fat man's gut, and he just buried it so deep that out of that hole, the man's dung started to come out of that hole. All right, which you're like, well, why do we need that detail? And it comes in play later in the story. So verse 23, then Ehud went out into the porch and closed the doors of the roof chamber behind them and then locked them. So he locks this dead Eglon in the chamber up on the roof. And then verse 24, when he had gone, the servants came, and when they saw the doors on the roof chamber were locked, they thought, now I wonder why they would think this, surely he is relieving himself in the closet of the cool of the chamber. So they see the locked doors, and what do they smell? Oh, king is in there relieving himself. And so they just assumed that was what was going on. Verse 25. And they waited till they were embarrassed, so it must have been a while. But when he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber, they took the key and opened them. And there lay their lord, dead on the floor. Ehud, meanwhile, in verse 26, escaped while they delayed. And he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Serah. When he arrived, he sounded the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim. Then the people of Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was their leader. And he said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan against the Moabites, and did not allow anyone to pass over. And they killed at the same time about 10,000 of the Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. Not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel. And then the land had rest for 80 years. It's just this really odd story of this person being used in a way that no one would have thought of. And one of the things that I like about this story is it can teach us that God will use you and I to be messengers of hope, to be the people who spread the gospel and the light of the kingdom into the darkest places of the earth, but not in the way that everybody else thinks that he should. Everybody else thinks, oh, you need that strong right arm. But God will take you and he'll use your left arm to do things. He'll use what would be considered a weakness. And that would have been considered a weakness in that day to be left-handed. And so God will use even your weaknesses to confound the enemy. And that's a promise that we receive from him in the scriptures as well. So we have Othniel and Ehud, okay? One from the tribe of Benjamin, Ehud, and one from the tribe of Judah, Othniel. And it's interesting, and I believe that there's a purposeful tie-in here, that Othniel and Ehud, both from the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, the first two kings of Israel. One was from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul, and one was from the tribe of Judah. That would have been David. And Saul, of course, was displaced by David, who would have been the greater king, the greatest king, the one who chose intimacy with God over everything else, a man after God's own heart, who would have his throne would be established forever. He is the one who, Jesus is actually a descendant of King David through Joseph and Mary. And then you have Saul, who was chosen to be the king, yet he made a bad sacrifice and he made some bad decisions, and so he was rejected by the Lord because of that disobedience to be the king over Israel. Well, take that all the way back to the New Testament, and we have another Benjamite. Okay, we have another Benjamite named Saul, who liked to go around persecuting Christians, and this would have been Saul, the Pharisee, and he was a Benjamite, and he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he saw the light, literally, and God took Saul and transformed him and turned him into Paul, and he was absorbed into the kingdom of the one king, the Lion of Judah, his throne would last forever. And so here we see these lesser kingdoms being drawn into the greater kingdoms. And I don't think it's an accident then that we see the first two judges of Israel are also from those two tribes. I think maybe that God's trying to tell us something there, that we need to understand that just because someone is a Benjamite doesn't mean God can't use them, just like he used Saul. He has always been in the business of redeeming that which everybody else thinks can't be used. And if you remember reading Paul's story, the rest of the church didn't want to accept Paul. They didn't want to accept that he had become a Christian. And it was only through the encouragement of one man that they were able to do that. And to receive him as a brother. And of course, then he ends up writing most of our New Testament, and a lot of our doctrines and theology we get from Paul's understanding of the scriptures. And so we're very thankful that God will use even Benjamites in the kingdom. Let's read finally, and then we'll bring it to a close. But this is also a good story, even though it's just one verse. We'll learn about Shamgar. Shamgar, in verse 31, it says, after him was Shamgar the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. And that's his whole story. That's his whole story. The Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. Now, he's mentioned again later in chapter 4 in Deborah's song, but sort of in a negative light. But it's this idea that Shamgar, who's the son of Anath, killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. And that makes you think of the mighty men who served under David, but also of Samson, who killed the Philistines. He had the jawbone that he went and killed people with, and so he had this ox goad, this shepherd's staff, if you will, that he used to kill 600 Philistines with. It makes me even think of King David, where he just had his sling and a stone, and he took out Goliath, the giant Philistine. And he killed many more Philistines in his day, obviously. But even as a shepherd, he told stories about how he killed a bear and a lion with his bare hands and delivered the sheep from it. And so David, it sort of embodies the lives of all of these judges just in one man. But here, this story of Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. It's when you start to see stories like that where God just filled somebody up with the Spirit of the Lord. And it didn't take, 600 Philistines is a far cry from the 10,000 that fell. And I think it was 10,000 in verse 29 that fell to Ehud, and they killed at one time about 10,000 Moabites, all strong, able-bodied men. This was just 600, but then you realize, that was 600 with one man and an ox goad. He didn't even have a sword. Okay, he just clubbed them and killed them. And it says that he also saved Israel from the Philistines, who had been apparently oppressing Israel. But of course, the only reason God would have sent Shamgar, the son of Anath, to deliver them was because Israel obviously turned away from God yet again, which is their propensity to do. They do this over and over and over again, but when they call on God, he is faithful to answer. And I think that's our good word for today, that we see the faithfulness of God in this chapter, as we will in all of the chapters ahead. So next week we're going to look at chapter 4, Deborah and Barak, and we'll learn about their stories. That's another, not really a Sunday school story, although I think I remember learning it in Sunday school. I think I remember my mom teaching this to me in Sunday school about this young lady with her tent peg. But we'll get to that a little later. So until next week, love you all, and I bid you peace. Bye.